All right. Well, as people are starting to join in, we'll have, I think, a few people coming in the opening minutes of this presentation and discussion. First of all, thank you so much for the time. For the next hour or so, we're going to be stepping through the State Street Framework Plan, which some of you may be familiar with, others may not. So I just want to thank you for spending the time with us tonight. We're hoping that it'll be a good discussion and that that we are able to hopefully answer your questions as well as get some good input from you too about the next steps for this project. My name's Alex Dupy. I'm with MIG. We're part of the consultant team that was hired by Capital City Development Corporation to develop a framework plan for the State Street corridor. We'll go into more detail about what that means and kind of the key elements of that. But before I do that, I want to introduce the project team, and then we'll get into the specific pieces we're going to talk about tonight. So Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Alex. My name's Matt Edmond. I work at CCDC, the Director of Parking and Mobility, and also the project manager at CCDC for this State Street district effort.
Great, thanks, Matt. Jordan, how about you?
Sure, thanks. My name is Jordan Neerdels. I'm the communications manager at CCDC, and yeah, thanks for spending your evening with us, and excited to hear your questions and feedback.
Great, thanks. Karen?
I'm Karen Gallagher with the City of Boise in the long range planning as a transportation planner. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Sue?
Hi, everybody. My name is Sue Garner, and I'm with MIG. I'm supporting Alex in here, and I will be manning the chat box to make sure that all of your questions are answered.
Great, thank you. I was going to rename myself from MIG Portland so everybody knows who I am. Before we get started, so because this is a Zoom meeting, of course, and we have a number of individuals who have called in, I want to just talk about how we're going to manage this meeting, and hopefully it'll go smoothly as well for this. But partly to be able to do that is we're going to use all of the capabilities of Zoom to be able to to make this meeting successful. So there's a couple ways as we step through this presentation. I have muted everybody as we come in because we have about 35 or 40 people signed up for this meeting, so that's a good number of folks. So as we are stepping through the presentation, first of all, don't feel like you have to wait until the end of the presentation to ask a question. We're hoping that this is much like an open house that you would experience in person for any other type of meeting. We want to make sure that as questions come up, we can bring those into the discussion and we can answer them there the best we can. And then have some time at the end just to, as a Q&A, we'll have it more conversational. So there's a couple ways to do that. So if you are good with your keyboard or like to type, the chat function is excellent. That's at the bottom of the screen. It's a little bubble. Go ahead and click that, and Sue is going to be managing that chat feature. So as we're presenting and talking about pieces, she, as well as the rest of the project team, will looking at that as well to make sure that there's any questions or conversation that comes into the discussion, we'll bring that over. So chat is a great way to do that. We'll also save that chat so that we have a record of the conversation. The other way to provide input or to get our attention is at the bottom of the screen. There's a little kind of smiley face reaction. It's called reactions. And within there's a raise hand. It's also within your participants list. If you open up participants, it's in there as well too. Just click that. And what that'll do is that'll take your name and it'll put it right to the top of my screen so that I can see that you've raised your hand, and we can call you on that, and then you can ask any question or provide input as whatever you want to do with that. If you're on a phone and you don't have access to the online features, click *9. *9 will also give a raised hand feature, and then we'll make sure we can get you into the conversation. So with that, we'll do our best to manage and make sure that everybody has a chance if you want to speak and provide input. But again, really feel free to, as we're stepping through this, don't wait for the end. Make sure if it's fresh on top of your mind, just drop it in the chat, raise your hand. We're happy to stop and talk through some pieces. So with that, let's start. So we have a few different elements that we're going to cover over the next hour or so. first of all, why are we focusing on State Street? You know, it's a big corridor. There's a lot happening in the corridor, but why, you know, why are we focusing on State Street today? There's been a lot of questions about that. But then also some other pieces of, you know, why are we focusing on State Street and why do we use urban renewal? And so Matt's going to talk a bit about urban renewal in general and how that applies specifically to the corridor. Some of you may have taken the 2 surveys that we've had out. We'll provide a quick summary of survey 1, which talked about kind of key opportunities and priorities, and then survey 2, where we actually asked you to prioritize through a budget exercise where and how you would spend money on specific types of projects. We'll show the results of that, and then actually those draft project lists that came directly out of that public engagement. We'll get to the types of projects and where those projects are located, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the next steps. So a lot to cover tonight, but you know, I think we have plenty of time, and feel free just to chime in as things pop up. All right, so let's just talk about the schedule for, you know, kind of how we got to where we are today. There's been a lot of planning that's occurred on State Street for years. You know, this is not really the first iteration, but this is a key element of actually how we start to implement a number of the projects that you know, were slated for the State Street corridor. Specifically to the framework plan, you know, this started back in June to September, where we did some baseline analysis. We did a market analysis to see, you know, really what the development potential is with the corridor. We also looked at other contexts, like where is transit, bicycle and pedestrian amenities? What are other projects programmed for the corridor that we should know about? And that includes not just CCDC, but that includes the city, that includes ITD, Idaho Transportation Department, Ada County Highway District, Valley Regional Transit, a whole sort of, you know, different agencies and groups responsible for the function of this corridor. We took all of that information and we asked you through a public survey in late 2020 about where your priorities should, you know, where you think the key improvements should be and what those should look like. And then we came back out in February and March to actually take those projects and start to apply, if you have a certain amount of money, how would you break that up amongst all of the various needs and, you know, kind of identification of issues within the corridor. With that, there were a number of neighborhood meetings that Matt conducted, as well as a lot of interagency coordination. As I spoke, you know, there are a number of groups and departments that actually work within this corridor. So we need to understand how they see it, how they function and perceive this plan moving it forward holistically. Where we're at now is a draft framework plan. And so why we are here tonight is to get your input on some of those draft project lists. And not just the lists, but how they're prioritized and where they're located. And so it's very important for us now as we get into the next steps, which is actually drafting the plan and taking it through adoption in the fall, that we have, you know, a good sense of, you know, what you think are the most important pieces to carry forward, you know, as priority topics or priority projects. So we've done a lot and we continue to have a lot to do in the next few months. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt in just a second, but to talk about why State Street. But also tonight, we're going to be doing a little bit of polling. We have 5 questions that we're going to ask you throughout this presentation, and partly this is for us to understand your perspective and where you're coming from, but also as participants in this meeting, it's to understand where everybody else around you virtually, where their perspectives and where they're coming from, so that we have a, you know, kind of an understanding, a shared understanding of the discussion this evening. So with the first question mark, I am going to launch our first poll. Can everybody see that? Great. So with these polls, we're going to give you about a minute or so to step through each one of them. This first question is, which of these best describes how you use State Street? And you can answer as many of them as you want. Oh, we got a few more folks out of there. Let's go another 15 seconds or so. All right, a couple more people. And it's okay if you don't want to vote. You don't have to do that. All right, gonna shut it down. And I'm gonna share the results. All right, so let's see where people are coming from tonight. So most people drive through this area, which isn't surprising. It's a major corridor, you know, in the Boise metro area. But a lot of people live near State Street. So your experience may be different than somebody who just drives through it. And so how you experience it as a pedestrian or as a cyclist, as a driver, or as somebody who takes transit, those are different types of experiences as we think about this corridor. There's also one person who says you try to avoid it at all costs, which is not surprising. We've heard that a few times. But yeah, I mean, if you don't like driving in traffic, or you know, if you're a pedestrian or cyclist, we've heard that a lot about kind of, you know, how this corridor functions. But it is that critical link between many of the major communities and the businesses and the residents that support that. Interesting on this one, about half of you walk or bike on the corridor. So we're going to be talking a fair bit about that tonight. And so as you're thinking about these responses, maybe think about what, and you know, if you want to drop in the chat or whatever, what is that experience to you? Like if you walk or bike in the corridor, what's that like? If you drive, you know, what do you think about it when you're on that street? But also if you live or work near State Street, what's it like to live near that corridor? And dropping that in the chat, I think is a good way to get that conversation started. All right, so I'm gonna stop that. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, back to the question of why State Street. So as you all probably know, State Street's the only regional east-west corridor on the north side of the Boise River that connects downtown Boise with parts west. Back in the early aughts, a consortium of local governments, land use and transportation, you know, determined that State Street can't feasibly be widened to accommodate single occupant vehicle demand and an acceptable level of service during rush hour. So that means everyone in their cars, you know, roughly 85, 90% car mode share that we see elsewhere in the city. So there was a consensus that something needs to be done to shift the mode share on State Street and get, you know, more people out of their cars, single occupant at least, and doing things like transit, mainly transit, but also carpooling, biking. So there's been an effort to really look into that, and this effort's been basically to bring urban renewal planning tools, urban renewal tools to build on these previous planning efforts. So next slide, please. So you can see the study area in yellow along State Street, basically runs from 27th Street out to Horseshoe Bend. It's roughly 575 acres, including rights of way. The reason it looks like this is we wanted to capture as much of State Street within Boise city limits where there is opportunity for redevelopment and where we can kind of promote that transit-oriented development at the identified nodes, as well as things like walking and biking along the corridor. The whole corridor is within city limits, so you'll notice basically the west half of it is only on, it only takes properties on the north side of the road, because the south side is Garden City. The full width of the right-of-way, though, is within city limits and within the study area. So next slide, Alex. So going back to why State Street, you can see a number of planning documents that have occurred over, you know, Blueprint Boise and the State Street TTOP back in 2011, the corridor implementation plan that was done in 2019, and the Transportation Action Plan in 2015. So the reason we're embarked on this effort is to make the corridor more walkable, improve the infrastructure along the corridor. That will in turn foster development to increase the housing supply and diversify development types. Generally foster that transit-oriented development and implement these previous plans. Next slide. So real quick, SB Friedman Development Advisors, they are doing a feasibility study for this. They've already got a draft out, it's on the website. But one of the first steps they did was a market analysis of, does it make sense to do, to put up an urban renewal district in this area? Is there the demand over 20 years? And what they found based on previous demand and capture in this corridor area was they expected to see about 1,100 single family residential units. Those are generally away from the nodes. 2,600 multifamily, generally closer to the transit nodes, as well as 362,000 square feet of retail, 50,000 square feet of office, and one modest sized hotel along the corridor within that study area. And so to give you a quick idea of what that looks like, here's an aerial of Collister Street, basically looking northeast, generally from the river. So, and here is an aspirational rendering. This was in the 2019 State Street TOD implementation plan. This is not to get overly prescriptive. This is, it's basically an aspirational concept, subject obviously to the market, to owner and developer prerogatives, which are in turn subject to regulatory approvals by the city of Boise and the highway district primarily. But some things I would point out, we do expect to see infill opportunities at these older commercial areas, which would entail things like buildings that face the street, vertical mixed use, with active ground floor spaces or uses, shared parking behind the buildings to improve that parking utilization, potentially structured parking where feasible, but structured parking is generally pretty cost prohibitive, so that would be used on a limited basis throughout the corridor. Pedestrian oriented streets or drive aisles that are perpendicular to or parallel to State Street, because as I'm sure all of you know, it's not the most comfortable street to be right next to. And then along this, on State Street, to try to make it more comfortable for people that aren't in a car. Landscape buffers, possibly landscape medians with street trees and consolidated access to minimize the number of breaks across those sidewalks and multi-use pathways, which are also shown here. You can actually see from the left side where you've got in-street bike lanes going to a multi-use pathway over by where those buses and transit stations are on the right. The reason for that being it's a higher level of comfort for those people that do bike rather than being right next to a road that has 30 to 40,000 cars a day. It also removes the conflicts with buses that are curbing at bus stops. So, and this is a direction that the highway district is going in as well. They made a recent policy change on that.
And I think, Matt, before just to jump in on some of the comments, when you were talking about the multi-use path and kind of how from a lower stress standpoint, we've had a few comments within the chat essentially supporting the need for something like that, just being generally uncomfortable being on the bike lanes. Or there was a comment here from Patricia about, I put my bike on my car and then drive it to a greenbelt. I'm not going to even ride on State Street to get to the greenbelt. So it's avoidance, or get through it quickly and get off it as quickly as possible if you're on a bike.
Yeah, the greenbelt's a good option. It does have some continuity issues as you get further west. So what we would aspire is to make State Street a fairly high comfort corridor for people on bikes, an alternative to the greenbelt.
Right. Thank you. All right, there was a question about, is underground parking a potential? Hate to take surface area for cars.
That's a great question. So underground structured parking is fairly expensive. Underground parking is generally about twice the cost per space. I do understand that sentiment. Parking garages are not pretty things. surface parking, even less so. So some kind of cost-effective ways to do this is podium parking, maybe, where you've got parking on the ground level, but you build over it and you wrap around it, maybe with retail wraps, or even if you do a parking structure, to have those retail wraps at least at the ground floor. So if you come downtown, and if you're familiar with the Capitol and Main, 9th and Main garages, they kind of have retail wraps, and the only place on the ground level you really know it's a garage is at the entrance or exit. But absolutely, I don't think anybody's enamored of the aesthetics of parking.
I think one of my favorite planning terms is called the Texas donut, which is essentially a parking structure, but it's surrounded by housing, retail, other pieces. So you still have that structured element to be able to provide the parking, but as Matt said, it's not a parking structure per se from the exterior. But the Texas donut, it's my favorite planning terms. All right, so let's.
Hey,
Alex,
yes. I see a comment about it would be nice to have a pedestrian area like the Grove. We did look at that, and I guess Alex will walk through it on the frameworks, but the Collister neighborhood expressed an interest in having some sort of public use plaza or something. You know, maybe it's at the Collister Shopping Center, maybe it's across the street, but we do have that accounted for.
Great, thank you, Matt. All right, so that's kind of, you know, just some thoughts, just in a nutshell, of why State Street. So let's talk a little bit about urban renewal and kind of the role of urban renewal. And so I'll leave it with Matt, but we're going to have another quick poll because they're fun. And I forgot to mention also too, and everybody has their video off, but if you do want to turn your video on, that's perfectly acceptable. It doesn't have to just be us on the top of the screen. If you don't want to turn it on, that's okay too, whatever you're most comfortable with, but you don't have to have it off if you don't want to. So I just want to make sure people know that. All right, so let's launch a poll about urban renewal. So let's just kick this off to see where everybody's coming at from experience with urban renewal. How familiar are you with the concept? We got a few more voters out there. Give it about another 15 seconds or so. All right. All right, let's close it down. All right, so the question, how familiar are you with urban renewal? We have a few people looking for Matt's job, managing an urban renewal district, it looks like. People very familiar with it. But, you know, kind of, you know, not surprising, you know, urban renewal, a lot of people know the term, but not necessarily how it works. And so we're going to step through that just to give some background on, you know, what urban renewal is and how it might apply to State Street. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Sue, you're correct. We will get into some of the improvements along State Street and what those might look like in a little bit. So just hold tight, Natalie, and we'll get to that comment here when we talk about the frameworks. Oh, sorry, I forgot to share the results. So anyway, so as I was saying, so there are a few folks in the audience who know a lot about urban renewal more in depth, but for the most part, for folks who responded to the poll, kind of know what the term is, but not necessarily how it functions. All right, so with that, Matt, I'm gonna turn it back over to you.
Sure, so first and foremost, urban renewal is an economic development tool. We're talking about State Street here, and so it's hard not to focus on the corridor, you know, what there is between the curbs. And I wanna emphasize that while we are talking about funding improvements along that, you know, along the corridor, we're not talking about assuming the role of the Highway District, the Idaho Transportation Department. You know, they have sole jurisdiction over the roads and, you know, major road widening projects and all. But we are looking to help fund improvements that they wouldn't otherwise fund. So primarily a funding mechanism through tax increment financing, which I'll explain in a few. And a way to invest in public infrastructure in areas to catalyze private development and investment. And financing economic growth and development. And one other thing I would say about it, so we've got the tax increment. Another thing that we do that the market can't really do per se is we may acquire a piece of property like we've done it with Ash Street Townhomes or the water cooler and put it out to a request for proposals rather than just, you know, say a land auction going out to the highest bidder. You know, our board asked for, well, what's the best, what are the best ideas the development community has for this piece of property? And generally we're looking to accomplish what, you know, what we've heard from the community on it, you know, mixed use, mixed income, affordable housing, things like that. So really finding what the best development solution is for the community for a piece of property rather than just that kind of highest bidder auction. So next slide. In a nutshell, we use urban renewal to deliver development outcomes that have significant public benefit that the private market alone would not deliver on its own. So. Real quick on the role of CCDC, so Capital City Development Corporation. We're the urban renewal agency for the city of Boise as authorized by state law. And at this point, I think most of the cities in Ada County have an urban renewal agency. I think Star may be the only one without. We have no regulatory authority, as I mentioned earlier, on State Street with regard to transportation, land use, preservation, or otherwise. What we do is seek to catalyze investment through several ways. One is our own projects where we budget for it, we design it, we bid it out. Second way is a partnership with other public agencies. So say the highway district is going in and they're going to widen a section of State Street in the future. We'll enter into an agreement with them to do those landscape buffers with trees and irrigation and all. So. And then the third way is public-private partnerships where we work with developers and give them incentives for things that we think have public benefit and help them to offset their public costs because generally when a development comes in, there's some amount of public infrastructure that has to be along with it. So those are the three ways we work. Again, we work hand in hand with neighbors, with local partner organizations and developers to redevelop underutilized parcels and improve public spaces.
Great, thanks, Matt. Matt, just a couple questions came in through the chat. Just to clarify, when referring to the corridor, from where to where?
27th Street at the east end and Horseshoe Bend Road at the west end.
Great, and then one other question from James. I know some people are concerned about local resources such as schools will not be able to accommodate growth. Can you explain how urban renewal addresses this concern? How schools will not be able to accommodate growth.
Well, we do have a tri-party agreement between CCDC, the Boise School District, and the City of Boise, and we are in discussions with the Boise School District. They have two campuses within the district out here, Taft and Lowell. We're in discussions with them about how we can partner with them on any potential campus improvements. Taft, I think they're looking at potentially doing a renovation there with their next bond measure. So we work hand in hand with the school district to help them resource where it makes sense.
Great, thank you. Good questions. All right.
So real simple schematic on tax increment financing and how it works. So should a new State Street urban renewal district be formed, the county assessor is going to set the current value for each property in the district as the base value you see there in the light blue. Over time, as public and private investments occur in the district, you can see the red there, the property values increase, and that increase in value over the base is called the increment value. the levy rates applied from the underlying taxing districts against that, and the taxes generated against that incremental value go to CCDC to pay for these public improvements and other revitalization activities.
Great. Matt, another question for you. Put you on the spot again.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, one last thing before that. So when the district sunsets, you can see in the dark blue there, all of that, all that increment reverts to the local taxing districts. So their base is frozen for 20 years, but it reverts afterward. So what's the question?
And so that's actually kind of, I think, along those lines is who will pick up the tax responsibility for the URA. And Lori, if you need more detail, maybe raise your hand and we can unmute and we can talk about it. But Matt, if you understand that question, we can certainly take a stab at it.
Sure. So you would expect some natural increase in the property values out here, and it's forecast. It's it's a number that's certainly much lower than the current valuation increase we've seen year over year most recently. But there's some natural increase, but we anticipate the increase from actual development and reinvestment to be significantly more than that. And we expect a lot of this development is stuff that wouldn't otherwise occur in the absence of that urban renewal assistance. Just because things like local streets, significant utility expansions, certainly the landscape buffers along State Street, they wouldn't occur in the absence of urban renewal.
Great, thank you, Matt. All right, so that's urban renewal in a nutshell, and we can come back to that if there are other questions about kind of how it functions and in relation to State Street or more in general. But I wanted to shift just a little bit to talk about some of the community involvement that has gone into this project. Within the context that we've been, within a pandemic for the past 16 months, and so and it's not just this project, but pretty much every project in the country has had to rethink how we do public engagement in many ways, and so we would love to meet in person through this, and hopefully at the end of this project, as we're meeting with the commission and others, that those will become in-person meetings. But for the community engagement that we've done through this project, with the exception of some of the meetings Matt has been able to do recently with neighborhood groups, we've focused on online resources. And there's some pros and cons to that. The pros is that there is often a much bigger reach with online engagement than really specific elements of that. And so when we look at some of the results that we got from the online surveys, we were actually getting people from all over the region actually responding to this survey about how they use State Street. And so that's really rich information that is actually thousands of data points that go through, which is not something you can typically do with an in-person event. And so while we always like to partner up our online with in-person meetings, we feel strongly that we got a good cross-representation of the community, both from a travel standpoint, but also from people who experience it on a daily basis as residents and businesses within the area. And hopefully we can meet again in person here soon. I think we're all excited to get out of our houses to talk with one another in person. So with that, let me just show briefly some of the pieces that we've been doing. As I mentioned, we had 2 online surveys. The first survey was much broader reach, where we had about 565 responses, which is a great turnout for an online survey. And within that survey, both survey 1 and survey 2 were map-based surveys. So within each question, we were able to place points and ask further questions. So each of these surveys have thousands of data points within them. So respondents are able to provide, where you typically put the sticky note or the little circle sticker on your favorite ones. We could do that, and then we could actually follow up with more questions for those sticky notes. So really rich and deep responses. Matt attended 6 neighborhood meetings across the corridor. So we were able to reach out to every neighborhood group represented in the corridor within Boise. We also were able to meet with technical partners, Ada County Highway District, Valley Regional Transit, Idaho Transportation Department, to understand kind of key issues and to make sure that we're aligned moving forward for specific project types. As Matt mentioned, we've met with the Boise School District and actually have a strong relationship with them for how to move this process forward. And then also meeting with other groups like Preservation Idaho and the State Historic Preservation Office, we know that there are resources throughout this corridor that are very important both to kind of neighborhood context, but also the history of the area. And so that's an important coordination point for when we think about projects and how to support that. And then finally, also thinking about the adjacent jurisdictions, reaching out and coordinating with Garden City. While they're not part of the urban renewal area, they are adjacent, and they have been a part of many of the projects along the corridor. So still a very important partner, but not necessarily just for this urban renewal project. So I'm just going to step through some of the results. Survey 1, and this is really consistent with what we've already seen in the chat. Almost 70% of people who've responded to that first survey think providing amenities like for walking, biking, and transit are the top priorities. And that was across the corridor. And you can see the heat map on the side shows examples of where some of those hot spots were, where people placed a lot of pins. But also not just the corridor, but how we connect to adjacent neighborhoods. So once you're off the corridor, how do you start to get into the neighborhoods in a safe and effective way if you're a bicycle or a pedestrian user? And also thinking about transit, you're always a pedestrian before and after when you get on and off the bus. And so even if you ride transit, you're still a pedestrian at some point in that trip. A majority of people also said streetscape is important, whether that's landscaping, wider buffers, medians, those specific elements are also important to people. And then, a major piece of this, part of it is the infrastructure, but it's also kind of the broader economic development for the corridor. And people were very, strongly supportive of, supporting and growing local businesses there. And we heard through the same meeting that we did at noon, was that local businesses are really important to people along the corridor for daily services. And certainly continuing and supporting that through the project was important to the community here through this survey as well. So in the second survey, we took all of that information from the first survey, as well as some additional technical work that the project team did. And we asked community members to prioritize, if you had only limited funds, what and where you would fund those improvements. Like, where would you do bicycle and transportation improvements? Where are the highest priority for a transit investment? From an economic development or housing standpoint, what are locations in general that we should think about as we think about these framework plans that we'll cover in just a moment? And overall, the majority of people want to focus on mobility, primarily bicycle, pedestrian, and transit accessibility. ACHD and ITD already have plans on their side for the car side. These are the pieces that really go to support those other modes that happen along the corridor. Economic development and housing and placemaking were also very important, but not to the degree of mobility issues. And I think that's consistent with what we're seeing in the chat. Just a definition of placemaking, what is it? It's parks, plazas, art, kind of those key things that make a neighborhood or district unique, but also are the areas that really kind of allow people to congregate and talk and kind of be outside and be with one another. And so when we think about placemaking, that's a general term that applies to kind of urban form and urban realm and art and other amenities that kind of bring people together within development. All right, next question, the big question mark. All right, so with this, and if you've taken the survey, great, or if not, it's okay too. Do you agree or disagree with what the public has said about State Street? So really focusing on those core bike, ped, and transit mobility issues, looking at economic development and housing, focusing on those core public spaces within the corridor. All right, votes are coming in. Just a few more seconds, about 10, 15 seconds or so. All right, 5 more seconds. If any last voters. All right. Share the results. Well, I think we're in alignment with what we're hearing, which is great, and that's one reason we wanted to test this, to make sure that we're getting all opinions out there for this. So this is great. This is good confirmation for what we've been talking about. All right. All right. So let's move on here. All right. So let's talk about the meat of the plan. So the framework projects are essentially it's the framework plan. It's the projects and the ways that we're going to be moving ahead within this corridor for the next 20 years. And as I mentioned, many of these framework projects are based directly on the community input that we heard through the first 2 surveys, and supported by both this meeting as well as the open house that we just had at lunchtime today. They also include projects from other project lists and plans as they relate to the vision and kind of goals for what this framework plan is. So, for example, the Transit-Oriented Development Implementation Plan really focused on pedestrian and transit accessibility. So identifying where specific station pairs might be located, that's something that has been carried forward within the plan. Those multi-use paths are something that Matt has talked about that's become an ACHD guide. That's something we talked about previously within the TOD plan as a way to make pedestrian and walking and biking safer along the corridor. It does consider other corridor planning projects, as we showed for that Collister illustrative. There's a lot of work that's being done in the corridor already. And so, looking at kind of how these projects can support other projects that are happening throughout the corridor. There's just a couple comments. I'd like to see a greater emphasis on placemaking. Let's get into the projects. We do have a number of placemaking elements within there, but that's a great comment. And so we appreciate that. So we'll talk more about that. All right, so project types. So there are kind of 5 big buckets of project types that we'll step through some of the big pieces. And when we talk about mobility, we're really not talking about auto mobility. That's something that will be taken care of with ACHD and ITD. We're really talking about transit, multi-use path, local streets, potentially parking structure or structures to be able to access transit and support development. So it's really those core components around, kind of the State Street corridor. Infrastructure, that's a basic element of urban renewal. It's supporting that adjacent economic development, future development. So it includes things like curb and gutter to separate out the road from pedestrian and bike areas, water, sewer, fiber optic, those kind of core pieces that support development. Placemaking, and with the comments about placemaking, really looking at key areas of where people want to gather, whether those are festival streets, plazas, parks, and green space. Those are incorporated into kind of these key areas or these nodes that we've been looking at for ways to actually provide that. And it's not always kind of a traditional park. It could be a plaza. It could be a festival street that's designed to be able to, kind of support a market or even just gathering in a residential area. So really kind of focusing on those areas where we can come together. Economic development is a key piece, particularly for land acquisition, as Matt discussed. How do we further kind of the community goals for more housing in an equitable manner for both housing, but also mixed use development. And then special projects, public art, historic preservation, kind of other key specific pieces that make the corridor unique. So just some examples: mobility, it's paths, it's safer crossings for State Street, it's also parking, but also in the upper right corner, better transit stations, areas that are branded that actually support higher capacity transit. Those are those key things that start to change a corridor, and particularly for modes and how people use it. Infrastructure, it's the bread and butter. It's sewer and water, kind of the things that make everything work. Even though it's in the ground, it's very important for adjacent development. Placemaking, and this gets to some of those elements and some of the comments. Placemaking is part of having the space to do it, but it's also programming. So whether it's like a festival street there we go, didn't mean to go forward. whether it's a festival street or a splash pad or a plaza, something that, is a place for people to gather. It's also wayfinding. How do people get around? Some of the comments about getting to the Boise River, how do people actually get to those green spaces from the corridor? Economic development, this is a tool in many ways to be able to support those community visions, focusing on housing and mixed use development within the corridor. And then finally, those special projects, the historic elements, art components, potentially rehabilitation of some existing businesses or existing buildings. So how do you take an older building that's maybe, not maintained and create something new that's different, that's unique? So let's jump into the projects real quick. So these projects, we've broken out the corridor essentially into a number of nodes. So a way to focus it somewhat around transit, but also where there's those opportunity. And the bar chart on the right shows different types of investment assumed within each of these areas. And depending on where we're at, there's different types of investment. For example, Horseshoe Bend versus Glenwood. Horseshoe Bend is focused a lot on mobility and infrastructure because we're talking about local streets to provide better connections and support development, whereas Glenwood has a similar amount, but also looks at some of the placemaking elements with that as well too, in economic development. So it's with each of these, there's investment in each of the nodes. It's just different types of investment by project depending on where you're at within the area. So let's step through each of those right now. So we'll step through 5, starting actually at the bottom with number 5 and Whitewater Park Memorial, Veterans Memorial Parkway, and going to Horseshoe Bend. So with this section, looking at the Idaho Transportation Department headquarters, this has been an area that we've looked at a lot. The city has looked at it a lot. It's really kind of the major place where investment could occur throughout the corridor. And as such, a lot of investment through this plan could occur as well too, which could include utilities, local streets, potentially parking structure, public amenities, placemaking. But also when we see these big T's along the street, those are new premier transit stations. So those are branded transit stations that can support high capacity transit like Bus Rapid Transit, which provides faster headways and a more premium service throughout the corridor. We also, in this area and a couple of the others, so you'll see these insets in a few of the stations. These are locations that we looked at as a part of the transitory development plan. And so we actually looked at concept development for each of those. So you'll see the infrastructure, mirroring what we showed in those areas. Some of the other pieces, more in the neighborhood, some, trail connections. We're getting, better access to the trail from State Street, the small Festival Street up here, which is more of a residential connection, but also other investment outside of that ITD site in this area. As I step through these, think about State Street from a corridor standpoint too, a multi-use path up and down the entire length of State Street. So that is another investment that would happen within each of these corridors, as well as utility and median as needed to support the future development. When we move to the west, getting to Collister, it's actually a couple different station pairs. So new transit stations at Collister, and then just to the west. And these are areas where potentially investment in shared streets, in festival streets, and smaller connections for pedestrian pathways to be able to provide that connection to transit, but also better connections into the neighborhoods for bikes and peds. Looking at park amenities. Particularly within these two areas that have either the canal or other things we could build upon, but that don't have a ton of parks right in that location to be able to support that. And then as we move further west, Pierce Park Station is really more about some local connections and utilities, really focusing on the station in this area. And then with Bogart and Glenwood, we did a lot of work on the Glenwood station to think about how that might change over time. This is an area where potentially structured parking might occur at some point in the future, but also higher access to transit as well as parks and public spaces within both the Glenwood station, but also the Bogart station as well too. We know there's a lot of development that is occurring or will occur here soon, and to be able to support that through public space with access to transit is an important part of that specific station. And then finally getting to Horseshoe Bend, to the furthest west of the framework plan. This is an area that is lightly developed. You know, it has large parcels, but not a lot of access for future development. So looking at what a future local street connection or system might look like to be able to provide that access, but also being able to provide the utilities to be able to support that. So again, another transit station as a part of this, it's a core element of the plan, coupled with supporting economic development through some of those local infrastructure improvements. And again, park space as well too. So the question about placemaking is wanting to see more of it. There is a lot of that within each of the stations, but it's also, you know, in relationship to all the other projects that are happening there as well. All right, so we have 2 questions here as we step through that. All right, so I see a couple of questions come in. I'm going to start this one, and then we'll review the questions and get back to you. All right. So the first question is, there were a number of projects on the maps. What should we do first? And so we've broken these into the buckets: mobility, infrastructure, placemaking, economic development, and special projects. Those are those 5 buckets we talked about prior to the frameworks. All right, about 15 more seconds.
So as folks are finishing up answering there, I think this is a good question for Karen. At what capacity are buses being used right now? And why do we think people will use all of this new transit?
All right, so go now when they're still filling out the survey.
Sure.
Is that okay? Okay.
That's okay.
So yes, right now coming out of COVID, the buses are running, you know, below the levels they were pre-COVID. But that's not unusual for us, or I think any other cities at this point. However, yeah, you know, as cities grow, we've seen other cities put a lot of money into expanding roads to, you know, build their way out of congestion, and it doesn't work. Cities that have spent, you know, millions of dollars fare no better in congestion than those that didn't invest that much. There's been a whole big study on that. So we know we can't build our way out of congestion, and we know that if we make it convenient for people to take transit and that it's competitive in time travel, that they will choose that. And it's as we grow, it's one of the ways that we can get people to places in a timely fashion and use the infrastructure we have efficiently.
Thank you, Karen.
Hey, Karen, I would add to that. I believe the State Street route is Valley Regional Transit's most heavily utilized too. So that's there's already propensity to use this route.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
All right, so I'm going to shut down the polling here, and then let's see what people have to say. All right. All right, so aligned with what we saw with the second survey, mobility and infrastructure are the top things that people would pick first. Economic development, there was 1 vote. I'm curious though, and folks who were talking about placemaking within the chat, I don't see any placemaking votes here. So can you explain yourself? Okay. Do you, like for people who are talking about placemaking in the chat, is it important with mobility, or is it, when you think about the broad pieces, how that would come together? No pressure. All right, there's a comment from Natalie. Somebody who drives and also takes the bus. I'd love to see improvements to the transportation. If it became more convenient, I would use it more often. And that is part of the plan with Valley Regional Transit, is that to be able to provide shorter headways, which means, you know, how quickly the buses come, so that you actually can just walk out to a station and catch a bus. You don't even have to look at a schedule. But also, as Karen mentioned, being able to have those trips that are, you know, generally, you know, competitive with what you would experience driving in a car. So those are some of the bigger pieces that are actually planned for the corridor outside of this project, but that have been considered over the past many years. Let's see, a couple things coming in. James, access has to be in place before people will use placemaking. Also, there needs to be made attractive. Thank you for that. That's true. And then one other, you have to have mobility and infrastructure to accommodate placemaking. Otherwise, that's a great point. You can't have it if you don't have the stuff there. So, Jamie Lou, I appreciate that comment. And I think that's something, you know, many of these projects are not isolated from one another. You know, with local streets or, you know, placemaking, plazas, parks. Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, many of these things would actually happen with development. So it's a way to be able to get that community benefit as a part of a larger or broader project.
Yeah, Alex, I'm actually kind of curious because we've made several categories, you know, the festival streets like 8th Street or the Basque Block, parks. I think everyone's pretty familiar with parks, generally green space areas, public plazas, like probably the most well-known is the Grove Plaza, but also like City Hall Plaza. Smaller things, I mean, maybe it could be some benches, you know, a bolted-in bistro table. I'm wondering if people have, you know, if any of those work, or if there's a specific one or two of those that people have in mind. You know, if it's more green space or just, you know, kind of small public spaces, places to sit and all.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. So from a placemaking standpoint, what would this group's preference be? Or preferences? And feel free to raise your hand too. We can let you speak at all. You don't have to type if you don't want to. All right. Well, with that, think about that as we're coming into that. We're going to do one more poll, and
try to throw that curveball in there.
No, that's great. Think about Matt's comment about, you know, what would these spaces be? Like what kind of priority spaces would you want? You know, if we were to think about these specific elements within a broader development. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to do one last poll. And so for this one, we're talking about priority locations. So we talked about what are the priority types of projects. What are the actual highest priority locations do you think that these projects should occur in? So we have Whitewater Park, Veterans Memorial Parkway, Collister, Pierce Park, Glenwood, Bogart, and the Horseshoe Bend area. So where should we start? And while people are filling it out, James, great comment. In Sweden, they're replacing car parking spaces with bike parking along with tables and benches. Seems like a good idea to have small spaces like that. You know, if there's one good thing that's come out of COVID, I think it's really been interesting to see how people use public rights of way differently. You know, how, if you're a business and you could only have 25% capacity, how do you actually stay in business? Well, you use that public space in front of your business. And that has been a really interesting way. That's happened in Boise, it's happened in Oregon, it's happened in Texas, everywhere. People are starting to think about, you know, kind of what that public space means and how you use that most effectively for the community or to support economic development. So thank you for that comment. Green spaces to break up the concrete in buildings. Also a great cooling environment as we get into 100 and whatever degree temperature in the next several days. Landscaping and green space. Don't care much about the festival streets, fair point. Green space to offset heat from building developments. Yeah, and and it's a place to gather. It's a place to gather and throw a frisbee and run your kids around, or it's a place to drink coffee and meet with a friend. All right, so I think we got most people have taken the poll. So I'm going to give the poll about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to shut her down. All right, so let's see what people said. All right, so definitely focus on Collister and the Glenwood Station area. Veterans Memorial Parkway got a vote as well too. I'm curious for Collister and Glenwood, for people who voted for that, why did you vote for those locations? Okay, well, you can put it in the chat if you want. You're welcome to. Selfish reasons, close to home. Hey, that's okay. That's okay. That's why we ask. That's why we ask.
Alex, I voted, and I know I'm not supposed to participate, but man, both of those seem like they have the most potential with the services that are already there. I think about Caffeina and Collister, and just the businesses that are there lends themselves to.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Mary Beth, you had your hand up. But wait. Wait.
Yes, I did have my hand raised, and you know, I lived in this Northwest off of Collister for 26 years, and just seeing all the changes that have been happening in that area, even in just the past 5 years, there's already a big sense of community, and we could even build off that even more by creating some green spaces, and so that's why I put Collister.
No, that's great. And actually, you know, just from the meeting we had at lunchtime, Collister actually was, people picked Collister, you know, they ranked it very highly as well too. And I think there is, you know, what Jordan and Mary Beth, what you're seeing is there is an energy there, I think, and people are already going there, whether it's the library or kind of other spaces. It's an area that already is an active community space. And so kind of what I'm hearing is building that, you know, kind of increasing that and building upon what's already happening. A couple others, Glenwood is so crowded now, they need a change. I've seen too many car accidents in that intersection. Yes, that is a tough place to be if you're a driver, but especially if you're a pedestrian or bicyclist. And I know, you know, that's one reason why we were looked at Glenwood, is because there is opportunity up there. So thank you for that. A couple other comments: shady areas, bike parking, green spaces. Yeah, if we're going to support biking, make sure we have places for people to park. Another comment: Collister should be on hold for later. We've been hit with so much already. And I'm curious, are you talking about the previous State Street improvements to that, or is that just in general changes to Collister?
Well, I guess if it's any consolation, there's not a lot of work because of the way increment grows. There's really not a lot that we do in the first 5 years of a new district. So also, in all likelihood, because the Collister intersection was just built, we would probably, for any reconfiguration, certainly retrofit for multi-use pathways would be toward the end of a district rather than right away, if that's any consolation.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and that's another comment, I think. It's closest to my home, but did not vote for it. Not looking forward to increased traffic on my quiet residential street. So certainly a future development and traffic, there's, you know, definitely considerations moving forward. All right. One other comment, and Matt, I think this is to you. This came up as well at the noon session. Patricia had a comment about the street improvements were painful, but what about the homeless shelter? And so do you want to talk about maybe kind of what that means in terms of this project or not, kind of how that, what you've been hearing from the neighborhood?
We've heard a lot about it. I understand the mayor's got, that application is on an 8-week hold while they look at some alternatives. It's not something that we're currently involved in, and I don't anticipate us being involved in it, regardless of whether or not a district is formed along State Street. You know, it's if it does go in, it's a tax exempt parcel, so it's not like they're generating increment that we could, you know, do some sort of reimbursement agreement with them on. So yeah, I understand. I think the neighborhoods have some very valid concerns. I did a neighborhood meeting literally across the street from the Salvation Army site. So yeah, I appreciate the concerns. I hope the neighbors and the mayor and Interfaith can come to some resolution that you know, people are more or less satisfied with.
Great, thank you, Matt. All right, so we have about 20 minutes left. I do want to just talk about next steps. Then we have plenty of time to open it up for just questions and conversation. This is a really good discussion. I just want to make sure you know where we're moving in the next few months. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Matt.
So next steps following tonight's session, we will be collecting comments for the next couple of weeks. You're always welcome to comment all the way through this process, but we can make the most use of them between now and July 6th. At that point, we will be taking the draft documents to our board at the July meeting, just to say, here's the direction we're heading in, here are the comments we received, and that we will be looking to take into account with the final. Final plan documents we'll take to our board at their meeting on August 9th to consider for adoption. If they do elect to adopt it by resolution, we would then transmit the plan to the city as well as the taxing districts. It has to go to planning and zoning for a finding of conformity with comprehensive plan. We're looking for that to happen at one of their 2 September meetings. And should the P&Z find conformity, they'll send their recommendation to City Council, which would then consider the plan at a public hearing, hopefully in October. Again, that's a public hearing. If they pass it, that ordinance would go through 3 calendar readings, be published, recorded, and transmitted to the taxing districts to establish the State Street Urban Renewal District with a base year of 2021. So.
That's great, thank you. And in terms of public comment, Jordan, I'm wondering if you could post the website in the chat. So where we're at now is we are putting together an online map that you'll be able to see the corridor that we'll be able to get into the website, hopefully in the next couple of days, to be able to comment on that. And then we can also provide, we have contact information from the registration list, and we can provide that to make sure you know that that's up there if you do want to provide contact or additional comment. But we'll have this open for a couple weeks, and would love to have you take a look at it and see what you think, to be able to, you know, as we move this forward, getting into the draft plan and eventually hopefully adoption in the fall. Those are also public meetings for comment. So Matt, correct if I'm wrong, but there is public comment allowed within those meetings as well too.
So our board can accept comment, but it's not a public hearing. Neither is the P&Z meeting. The City Council meeting is the public hearing.
Great, thank you.
So.
And Jordan, Patricia had a comment. How are you accessing the community? What social media sites are being used?
Yeah, we've posted things on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram over the last year to promote the surveys and then tonight's event.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for the time. We have plenty of time here. If there are other questions, you want us to step back to any of the slides to talk in more detail. If we weren't able to answer all your questions, we have plenty of time to be able to step back and dig deeper if you want. So feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat, and we can use the time however you see fit.
And it looks like Patricia has a comment here or a question. I think Jordan maybe would be the best person to answer this, but just curious to know how we are assessing or accessing the community, and if social media and which social media sites are being used.
Yeah. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We've done some paid promotions on Facebook to try and reach as broad of an audience as we could. We've done some of our first surveys were in Spanish as well to try and reach the Latino populations. Matt has met in person and online with all of the neighborhood associations. It's been hard with COVID, but we're trying to do as best as we can. And then we also, you can sign up for newsletters on our website. That's the link I just posted. So we send out periodic updates as we post things to the website, different frameworks or planning documents to the website and updates.
That's great. And a kind of a follow-up question for that, James asked about Nextdoor. And Jordan, I'm not sure if you or Karen are using Nextdoor at all for other broader events. I know Nextdoor is kind of some people use it, some people don't.
Yeah, Nextdoor is kind of interesting because they don't allow for business profiles like you can on Facebook and Instagram. And so it would need to come from a personal account. And so we always try and encourage the neighborhood associations, presidents, and boards to share these opportunities on Nextdoor and with their networks and their own mailing lists. So that's how we've been trying to use that resource.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, Jordan. You know, from the State Street website is a good repository for all of the kind of the background documents and other pieces that we've been working on. So that's a great place to go. So if you are on Nextdoor, just cross-post it, drop it in your Facebook. We can reach certain amounts of people, but to really kind of broaden that network, we really encourage you to cross-post to your Twitter network or Nextdoor Facebook feeds as well too, because that helps get the word out, particularly in this important part of the plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Dominique, we have not sent out mailers. That is something that's a great suggestion, and something that we can work with the city on to get a mailing list as the commenting tools go on the website for this last bit of feedback. I think that's a really great suggestion that we should look into. So thank you.
All right. Any other questions, comments? This has been a great discussion. I appreciate it. All right. Well, with that, let me just talk. I know Matt talked about next steps for the project. So for this meeting, we have recorded this meeting. We'll post that online as well as a meeting summary of both this meeting and the meeting, which was the exact same format that we did at noon, to be able to pull those key pieces out. So we'll be able to get that out, here shortly. So if you do have people who have questions about what each meeting discussed or what that is, that will be available for you to be able to view if you want to. As Jordan Matt mentioned, we are getting that draft plan together, and so we will on the website have more information here shortly to be able to provide comment on that. Wasn't quite ready for this meeting, unfortunately, but we're getting close and should have that up here shortly for you able to review in more depth. There are some great documents on the website now, though, too, like a feasibility study. The framework maps are up there. So those types of pieces are available for you now to review. Let's see. So there is one other question from Patricia. Let's see, a friend posted this question on LinkedIn. What is the explanation from the city on how they think using an urban renewal district to functionally implement a local option tax for transportation corridor is consistent with the urban renewal district authorization in law? I'm actually going to give that to Matt.
Happy to take it. Patricia, I disagree with the premise of this. A local option tax is, I presume you're talking about for funding transit. The operations, the capital rolling stock. We're not talking about funding any of that through tax increment. We're talking about capital projects, brick and mortar, the standard things that are authorized in Title 50, Chapters 20 and 29 of Idaho Code about urban renewal and local economic development. I don't think there's anything in this that resembles local option tax to fund transit.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Hey, Alex, can I jump in really fast?
Sure.
Not on that question, but I saw one previously from Esther about reaching.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
No, I just noticed it about reaching refugee populations along the stretch of State Street. That's such a good point that you brought up, Esther, and something that we talked quite extensively about. How do we reach those populations? We talked about going through schools and trying to send home flyers, but of course with COVID, kids were in and out of school and that we couldn't use those resources. We talked about going through the library, but I would love to connect with you. And I don't know what your background or your involvement is, but I'd love if you have ideas of how we could connect with those populations. I will direct message you my email, and I'd love to connect with you if you have some suggestions.
Great, thanks, Jordan, and thank you for taking us back to that comment, so we can close that. It is super important to make sure that you're right. Not everybody's on social media. There's different languages spoken along the corridor. We want to make sure we can reach as many people as possible. So Esther, first, thank you for being here tonight, but also thank you for bringing that up to make sure we can follow through with that. So thank you. All right. Okay, so a couple other comments, Jordan. You can reach through local refugee groups, and I think Idaho Office of Refugees or On Refugees would be a great group to follow up with. And so what we'll do is, just as a reminder, we're saving all of these chats. And so for specific pieces like this, this is a repository for us to be able to pull from. And so, Jordan, as you're talking to Esther or we're developing the next pieces, these are great resources for us. So thank you for noting these down and capturing those. So that's good for follow-up. All right, so with that, I just want to thank you all for the evening. I know we're getting either close or through dinner right now, so I do appreciate your time. This is an important project for the corridor, and in your input, particularly now as we're getting into draft recommendations and how we move forward, it's at this critical junction of the project to make sure that we're addressing how you see, or what you see are the key pieces of this project, and really help us prioritize as we move forward. It's a great conversation about placemaking versus infrastructure. Which one do you do first? It's well, they're both important, but you need to think about having stuff on the ground before you can come together. So things like that are great for us to hear. So thank you. So with that, I'm going to send us off. Matt, any parting words for the good of the order?
No, just thank you everyone for taking time out of your evenings to come talk to us about this.
Yeah, this is great. And really check the website. We have contact information. As more information gets up, we can add you to the mailing list, and so we have that information to get out to you. So with that, thank you so much. Stay cool over the next few days as it gets too hot for pretty much everybody, I think. And yeah, stay cool, and let's stay connected. So thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
Appreciate it.
Thanks all of you.
Yeah, thank you.